A racist first-class passenger demanded a black man give up his premium seat, only to discover she was harassing the airline's CEO, who had personally revolutionized the company's inclusion policies. Marcus Thompson reached up to slide his leather weekender bag into the first-class overhead compartment of Skyline Airways Flight 21AA7. At 45, he cut an impressive figure even in casual clothes. His charcoal quarter-zip sweater and designer jeans might have been relaxed, but they were impeccably tailored. He'd learned long ago that as a black man in corporate America, even his off-duty appearance needed to be carefully curated. The Friday afternoon flight from Chicago to San Francisco was part of his monthly routine. While other airline CEOs traveled in private jets, Marcus made a point of flying commercial on his own airline at least once a month. "You can't fix what you don't understand," he always said. Today, he'd chosen to fly like any other passenger. No special treatment, no announcements, just another customer in seat 2A. He was settling into his seat, already pulling out the latest quarterly reports he needed to review, when he heard the distinctive clack of expensive heels approaching down the jet bridge. The sound was followed by an exasperated sigh that seemed to be engineered specifically to draw attention. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." Marcus looked up to find a middle-aged white woman with expensive highlights and a Gucci handbag staring down at him, her boarding pass held out like a royal decree. Her pearl necklace caught the cabin lights as she tilted her head expectantly. "Good afternoon," Marcus replied pleasantly, reaching for his own boarding pass. "I'm in 2A. The woman, who would later identify herself as Karen Wheeler, made a show of double-checking her ticket. "No, I specifically booked 2A. I always book 2A. Her voice carried that particular tone of authority that came from years of never being questioned. Marcus maintained his measured smile, developed through decades of similar interactions. "Would you mind if I see your boarding pass?" Karen pulled her boarding pass back slightly, as if afraid he might snatch it. "I don't need to show you anything. I know what seat I booked." She turned around, snapping her fingers to get a flight attendant's attention. "Excuse me, we have a situation here." A young flight attendant named Jessica approached, her professional smile firmly in place. "How can I help?" "The person is in my seat," Karen announced, finally extending her boarding pass to the flight attendant. "I need you to sort this out immediately. We're holding up boarding." Jessica glanced at Karen's boarding pass, then looked apologetically at both passengers. "Ma'am, your seat is actually 2C. This gentleman is correctly seated in 2A. Karen's face tightened. "There must be some mistake. I always book 2A. Always. I'm a Platinum Elite member." "I understand, Mrs. Wheeler, but for this flight, your assigned seat is 2C. It's still a window seat, just on the other side of the aircraft." "Well, why can't he move? I'm sure he wouldn't mind switching." Karen's eyes swept over Marcus dismissively. "I have very specific needs when I fly, and I've been a loyal customer for years." Marcus kept his expression neutral, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In his 23 years in the airline industry, he'd seen this script play out countless times, sometimes as a flight attendant, sometimes as a supervisor, sometimes as a passenger. The only variable was whether the person would back down gracefully or escalate. Karen, it seemed, was choosing escalation. "I really must insist," she continued, her voice rising. "I have connections at this airline. I know several board members personally." She turned back to Jessica. "Could you please call your supervisor?" As Jessica stepped away to call the lead flight attendant, Marcus reflected on his journey through the ranks of Skyline Airways. He'd started as a flight attendant himself, working his way through night school to earn his MBA. Every step up the corporate ladder had been a battle against preconceptions and prejudice. He remembered his first interview for a management position 15 years ago. The interviewer had assumed he was in the wrong room, directed him to the ground crew applications. Even after clarifying he was there for the senior operations manager position, the interviewer's skepticism had been palpable. "We're looking for someone with a certain executive presence," they'd said. Marcus had gotten the job anyway, his qualifications too impressive to ignore. He'd gone on to revolutionize Skyline's operational efficiency, saving the airline millions while improving customer satisfaction. Each promotion came with new challenges: board members who couldn't quite see him in leadership roles, clients who assumed he was support staff at executive meetings, colleagues who attributed his success to diversity initiatives rather than merit. Now, as CEO, he could have easily pulled rank to end this situation, but that wasn't his style. His experiences had taught him the value of patience, of letting things play out to their natural conclusion. Sometimes, the best lessons came from allowing people to fully reveal themselves. The lead flight attendant, Michael, arrived at the scene. He was an experienced crew member who had been with Skyline for over a decade. What seems to be the problem here? Karen launched into her complaint before anyone else could speak. This is completely unacceptable. I specifically booked 2A. I always sit in 2A. I have severe anxiety and I need this particular seat. Surely you can understand that this gentleman could sit anywhere else. Michael reviewed both boarding passes. Mrs. Wheeler, while we always try to accommodate our Platinum Elite members, seat assignments are final unless there's a technical issue or aircraft change. He glanced at Marcus's boarding pass. Thompson is correctly seated in 2A. Well, I need to speak to someone from corporate then, Karen declared, pulling out her phone. This is exactly the kind of poor customer service I've been hearing about lately when the board hears about this. As she dialed, more passengers were boarding, creating a bottleneck in the aisle. Many were openly staring at the unfolding drama, some even taking out their phones to record. Marcus noticed a young black teenager watching intently from the aisle, obviously disturbed by the scene. He gave the young man a reassuring nod. I don't understand why this is so difficult, Karen continued, her voice getting louder. Just look at him. Does he look like someone who regularly flies first class? I'm sure he was upgraded or used points or something. I pay full fare for my tickets. The cabin grew quiet at her implication. Jessica and Michael exchanged uncomfortable glances, while nearby passengers shifted awkwardly in their seats. Marcus remained still, his face composed but his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the only sign of his internal tension. He thought about his first time flying first class, back when he was a junior executive. Despite his suit and credentials, he'd been stopped 3 times between the gate and his seat, asked to verify his boarding pass. The flight attendant had checked on him so many times, ostensibly offering service, that a white passenger had complained on his behalf. Now, 15 years later, he was CEO of the entire airline and still facing the same prejudices. The irony might have been amusing if it weren't so exhausting. Karen was now engaged in an animated phone conversation, presumably with Skyline's customer service. Yes, I'll hold for a supervisor. No, this cannot wait until after the flight. Do you know who I am? Michael tried to intervene. Ma'am, we need to complete boarding. You'll need to either take your assigned seat in 2C, or we can help you find alternate travel arrangements. This is ridiculous. Karen's voice had reached a near shriek. I want his ID checked. How do we even know he has a valid ticket? He probably bought it with stolen credit cards or something. A collective gasp went through the cabin. Several passengers were now openly recording the interaction on their phones. The young black teenager in the aisle had tears in his eyes, and his mother was hugging him close, whispering something in his ear. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but I'm going to have to ask you to refrain from making unfounded accusations and racist insinuations. Racist? I haven't said anything racist. How dare you play that card? Karen's face had turned red. This is exactly the problem with society today. You people always make everything about race. Michael stepped forward, his expression now stern. Mrs. Wheeler, I need to warn you that discriminatory language and disruptive behavior are grounds for removal from the flight. Remove me? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I'm here for a meeting with your board of directors tomorrow. When they hear about this treatment. As Karen continued her tirade, Marcus noticed more phones being raised, more passengers recording. He could already imagine the viral video. Racist Karen harasses, black man in first class. It would be trending by the time they reached cruising altitude. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his executive assistant. Heads up, situation developing on flight 2187. Might want to monitor social media. Then he settled back in his seat, waiting to see how this would play out. After all, he had a feeling Karen's meeting with the board tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed. Karen remained standing in the aisle, her phone pressed to her ear as she waited to speak with the supervisor. The growing line of passengers trying to board had begun to grumble audibly, creating a ripple of tension through the cabin. Yes, I'm still holding. She snapped into her phone, then turned her attention back to the flight attendants. I want his ID checked immediately, and I want to file a formal complaint about how I'm being treated. Marcus maintained his composure, though decades of experience in the airline industry told him exactly how the situation would normally play out. As a former flight attendant himself, he'd seen countless entitled passengers make similar demands. The difference was, most of them hadn't been on their way to interview for a senior vice president position with the very airline they were currently berating. Michael, the lead flight attendant, stepped forward again. Mrs. Wheeler, we need to resolve this situation immediately. You're delaying the flight. Oh, now I'm delaying the flight? Karen's voice dripped with sarcasm. Not him? She jabbed a manicured finger in Marcus's direction. He's the one refusing to move to a more appropriate seat. A passenger in 1C, a middle-aged man in a business suit, finally spoke up. Ma'am, we all heard the flight attendant. He's in his assigned seat. You're the one causing a scene. Karen whirled around to face him. I don't remember asking for your opinion. This is between me and the airline staff. She turned back to her phone. Yes, finally. I need to speak to someone with actual authority. These flight attendants are being completely unhelpful. Marcus used the moment to catch Michael's attention and gave him a subtle shake of the head, a silent signal not to reveal his identity just yet. He was curious to see just how far Karen would take this, especially given tomorrow's scheduled interview. The customer service supervisor's voice was faintly audible through Karen's phone. Ma'am, I'm showing that your assigned seat is 2C. We cannot force another passenger to move from their correctly assigned seat. This is outrageous. Karen's free hand clutched her pearl necklace. I'm a Platinum Elite member. I have been flying with Skyline Airways for 20 years, and I have never been treated so disrespectfully. When I tell the board about this tomorrow... Marcus pulled out his laptop, opened his email, and began typing a message to his chief of human resources. The subject line read, Urgent. Situation with tomorrow's SVP candidate. He kept his movements deliberate and unhurried, even as Karen's voice rose another octave. I demand to know his name. Karen was now pointing at Marcus again. I want it for my formal complaint, and I want all of these flight attendants' names too. Everyone here is going to be hearing from my lawyers. Jessica, the younger flight attendant, had maintained her professional demeanor admirably, but Marcus could see her hands trembling slightly. He remembered his own early days dealing with hostile passengers, the way each confrontation had felt like a personal attack. It had taken years to develop the thick skin necessary for airline work. Mrs. Wheeler, Michael tried again, if you continue to harass other passengers and create a disturbance, we will have no choice but to remove you from this flight. Harass? I'm being harassed. This is reverse racism. That's what this is. Karen's voice had reached a pitch that made several nearby passengers wince. He's probably not even supposed to be in first class. I demand to see his ticket again. The young black teenager who had been watching earlier spoke up, his voice shaking but determined. Lady, you're being racist. Everyone can see it. How dare you? Karen gasped. I have many black friends. I even have a black personal trainer. I'm not racist at all. I'm just trying to sit in my proper seat. Marcus closed his laptop and turned to face Karen directly. Ma'am, let me be very clear. You are not in your proper seat. You are causing a disturbance that is delaying this flight, and you are making racist assumptions and statements that are making everyone uncomfortable. His calm, authoritative tone seemed to catch Karen off guard, but only for a moment. Oh, so now you're threatening me. I'm filing a police report too. This is assault. Several passengers laughed out loud at this, which only seemed to infuriate Karen more. She began furiously typing on her phone. I'm posting about this on social media right now. Everyone is going to know how Skyline Airways treats its loyal customers. Marcus couldn't help but smile slightly. He'd already received a text from his social media team. Videos of the incident were starting to circulate online. The hashtag #HowSkylineKaren was gaining traction. A new flight attendant approached from the back of the plane and whispered something to Michael. Marcus recognized her. Sarah had been with the airline for over 15 years. He saw the moment of recognition flash across her face as she glanced at him, followed by a professional mask of neutrality. Karen was still ranting, now to anyone who would listen. This airline used to have standards. I remember when people dressed properly for first class, when there was a certain level of quality control in the passenger manifest. Quality control? The businessman in 1C repeated incredulously. Just say what you really mean, lady. I know exactly what I mean, Karen retorted, and I'll be sure to tell the board all about it tomorrow. I have an interview for Senior Vice President of Customer Experience, and believe me, changes will be made once I'm in charge. Marcus's fingers flew across his phone's keyboard as he sent another message to his HR director. Cancel tomorrow's interview, documentation to follow. He'd seen enough. The cabin had become a symphony of camera clicks and whispered comments. Karen seemed to finally notice just how many phones were pointed in her direction. You can't record me without my permission. That's a violation of my privacy rights. Actually, Marcus spoke up, Skyline Airways passenger policy clearly states that recording is permitted as long as it doesn't interfere with crew member duties or aircraft operations. You agreed to these terms when you purchased your ticket. Karen's eyes narrowed. Oh, so now you're an expert on airline policy? What are you, Some kind of lawyer? Not exactly, Marcus replied, just as Sarah returned with what appeared to be a printout from the gate agent's desk. Karen wasn't finished. I don't care what you are. When I'm running customer experience at this airline, people like you won't be able to just walk into first class and take whatever seat you want. People like me? Marcus raised an eyebrow. Please elaborate on what you mean by that. Karen seemed to realize she'd said too much. I just mean people who don't understand proper airline etiquette. This has nothing to do with, I'm not. Not what, Mrs. Wheeler? Marcus's voice was still wrapped in silk. Not racist, because from where I'm sitting, in my correctly assigned seat, I might add, you've made it very clear exactly what type of person you think belongs in first class. The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the passengers still trying to board were watching the scene unfold with rapt attention. Karen's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and her face lit up with vindication. Finally, this is probably someone from corporate calling to sort this whole thing out. She answered the call with a triumphant expression. Yes, this is Karen Wheeler. Marcus could see Michael and Sarah exchanging knowing looks. They'd clearly figured out who he was by now, but were professional enough to let the situation play out. Yes, I'm still on the plane, Karen was saying into her phone. No, I will not calm down. Do you know who I am? I have an interview tomorrow with... What? No, that can't be right. Her face had begun to pale. The interview has been canceled? There must be some mistake. Marcus checked his own phone. His HR director had replied, message received, interview canceled. Legal has been notified to document the incident. Karen lowered her phone slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror as she looked more closely at Marcus. Sarah had handed something to Michael. It looked like a passenger manifest, and Karen's eyes darted between the paper and Marcus's face. Mrs. Wheeler, Michael said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin, I'm going to have to ask you one final time. Will you take your assigned seat in 2C, or do we need to escort you off the aircraft? The businessman in 1C smiled broadly. Oh, please make her walk. I want to see how this ends. Marcus sat back in his seat, his correct seat 2A, and waited. The next few moments would determine whether Karen would face her humiliation with what little grace she could muster, or if she would add being escorted off the plane to her growing list of social media infamy. Either way, he had a feeling the board meeting tomorrow morning was going to be very interesting indeed. Karen stood frozen in the aisle, her phone slipping slightly in her trembling hand. The silence in the first-class cabin was absolute, broken only by the faint sounds of camera shutters from the phone still recording the scene. Michael cleared his throat. Mrs. Wheeler, I need your decision. Will you be taking your assigned seat, or should I call for escort? Before Karen could respond, Sarah stepped forward with the passenger manifest, her professional mask cracking slightly as she addressed Marcus. Mr. Thompson, I apologize for not recognizing you sooner. Would you like us to handle this situation differently? The color drained from Karen's face as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. Her eyes darted to Marcus, then to the manifest, then back to Marcus again. Mr. Thompson? She repeated weakly, as in, Marcus Thompson, he supplied calmly, CEO of Skyline Airways. He turned to Sarah with a warm smile. And no, Sarah, please continue handling the situation according to our standard protocols. We wouldn't want to make exceptions based on connections to the airline. A wave of murmurs swept through the cabin, followed by several poorly suppressed laughs. The businessman in 1C was openly grinning now, his phone still recording everything. I didn't, Karen stammered, her hand clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles had turned white. This is all a misunderstanding. Oh, I think we all understood perfectly, Marcus replied, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that only comes from years in the C-suite. You made your views quite clear about who you think belongs in first class, who you think can afford full fare tickets, and what kind of standards you believe Skyline Airways should maintain. He stood up slowly, his full height and presence commanding the cabin's attention. You also made it abundantly clear what kind of leadership you would bring to our executive team, which is why I've already canceled tomorrow's interview. Skyline Airways is actively working to combat discrimination and bias in air travel. We clearly have a long way to go, but I can assure you that we won't get there by hiring executives who exemplify the very problems we're trying to solve. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Behind her, a line of passengers had gathered, many nodding in approval at Marcus's words. Now, Marcus continued, as my flight attendants have already explained, you have two choices. You can take your assigned seat in 2C, or you can be escorted off this aircraft. Either way, I suggest you make your decision quickly. We've delayed our other passengers long enough." The young black teenager who had spoken up earlier was beaming now, his phone held high to capture every moment. His mother squeezed his shoulder proudly. Karen seemed to deflate, her previous bluster evaporating under the weight of her humiliation. I'll take my seat," she mumbled, finally moving toward Tousse. As she stowed her bag and sat down, Marcus turned to Michael. "Please make sure our ground team knows that Mrs. Wheeler will need to be rebooked on a different airline for her return trip. Also, inform our legal department that she's being added to our no-fly list pending review." "The no-fly list?" Karen's head snapped up. "You can't do that. I'm a Platinum Elite member." "We're a Platinum Elite member," Marcus corrected. "Your status in miles will revoke the moment you begin making discriminatory remarks to another passenger, a policy I personally implemented last year. The fact that I happen to be that passenger is irrelevant." He turned to address the entire cabin. "At Skyline Airways, we believe that everyone deserves to travel with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, or any other factor. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, and we enforce it consistently, whether the target is our CEO or any other passenger." A smattering of applause broke out in the cabin. Several passengers were already posting their videos online, and Marcus's phone buzzed continuously with notifications as the incident went viral. The boarding process finally resumed, and Marcus sat back down in his seat, 2A, where he'd belonged all along. He opened his laptop and began composing an email to his executive team. Subject: improving our response to discrimination. Teamed at today. I witnessed firsthand how our frontline staff handles discriminatory incidents. While I'm proud of their professionalism, this experience has highlighted several areas where we can strengthen our policies and training. As he typed, he could hear Karen making increasingly desperate phone calls beside him. "Richard, it's Karen. I need your help. The interview tomorrow." "No, you don't understand. I'm already on the no-fly list. What do you mean you saw the video?" Marcus continued working on his email, outlining new initiatives to combat discrimination in air travel. By the time they reached cruising altitude, Skyline, Karen, and Javern CEO Karma were trending nationwide, with millions of shares and supportive comments flooding social media. A flight attendant, not Michael or Sarah, who were probably still recovering from the stress of the incident, came by with pre-flight drinks. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," she said warmly. "Can I get you anything?" "Just water, thank you," he replied, "and please call me Marcus." From her seat in 2C, Karen was still trying to salvage what remained of her reputation. "No, listen. You don't understand," she was saying into her phone. "I didn't know who he was. I would never have." "What do you mean my membership is being reviewed? I've been on the board of the country club for 10 years. Marcus smiled slightly as he returned to his email. He'd seen this pattern before. The backpedaling, the desperate attempts to minimize the damage, the sudden realization that actions have consequences. It was a pattern he'd observed throughout his career, from his early days as a flight attendant to his current position as CEO. His phone buzzed with a text from his chief of communications. "Videos everywhere. Want to get ahead of this with a statement?" Marcus typed back, "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow. We're announcing new anti-discrimination initiatives. Use this as a catalyst for change." That's what he'd always done. Turned obstacles into opportunities, transformed discrimination into determination. Every slight, every mistake about his belonging, every assumption about his capabilities had only fueled his rise to the top. The businessman in 1C turned around in his seat. "Mr. Thompson? I just wanted to say, that was masterfully handled. My daughter's starting her career in aviation, and as a black woman, she's faced similar prejudices. Seeing you in this position, handling this situation the way you did, it means a lot." Marcus smiled warmly. "Thank you. Please tell your daughter that Skyline Airways is always looking for talented individuals who share our values. Have her send her resume directly to my office." The young black teenager who had spoken up earlier was being moved up to first class. Apparently, another passenger had offered to switch seats with him. As he passed Marcus's seat, he paused. "Sir, could I take a picture with you?" "Of course," Marcus replied, standing to pose with the young man. "What's your name?" "Michael, sir. I want to be a pilot someday." "Well, Michael, I look forward to having you fly for us. Stay focused on your dreams and don't let anyone tell you where you belong." As they took the photo, Marcus could hear Karen's increasingly desperate phone conversation continuing behind them. "No, please, you don't understand. I need to speak to someone on the board." What do you mean they've all seen the video? The cabin had settled into a normal flight routine, but there was an energy in the air, a sense that they'd all witnessed something significant. Marcus returned to his laptop, but his mind was already racing with ideas for new initiatives: expanded diversity training for all airline staff, clearer protocols for handling discrimination, maybe even a scholarship program for aspiring pilots from underrepresented communities. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus glanced out his window, in his correctly assigned seat 2A. The sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Below, the city lights twinkled like stars, reminding him of how far he'd come from his first days as a flight attendant. He opened a new email draft, this one addressed to all Skyline Airways employees. Subject: Building a better skyline. Dear Skyline family, today we witness both the challenge we face and the opportunity before us. While no one should face discrimination in our cabins or anywhere else, these incidents remind us why our work matters. Behind him, Karen had finally fallen silent, staring out her own window in 2C, no doubt contemplating how a simple seat assignment had derailed her career ambitions. But Marcus was focused on the future, on turning this moment into momentum for real change. After all, that's what good leaders do. They take even the ugliest moments and use them to build something better. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and Marcus settled in for the flight to San Francisco. He had a press conference to prepare for, new policies to draft, and a chance to show the world that at Skyline Airways, everyone truly did belong in first class.